Hello and welcome back to the Argyle AI ML Technology Leadership Summit. My name is Vicki Lynn Brunska with Argyle. It's great to have everyone joining us today. Just a couple of notes before I turn things over to our esteemed speaker for this keynote session. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Lots of good meet and greet opportunities and complimentary materials there. Also, to ask questions throughout this session, simply type into the Q&A chat and we will address your questions at the end of the session. And now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Alejandra Para Orlandoni, VP, Ethical Innovation and Privacy at Takeda. Welcome so much, Alejandra, for your presentation titled Banning Bias, Methods for Managing AI Risk. Welcome again, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Vicki Lynn, and hi everyone, so glad to be here. We're going to spend some time discussing some of the risks we face when building and using AI and what we can do about them. I'm going to jump right in, so I'll keep introductions very brief. As Vicki Lynn said, I'm currently leading ethical innovation and privacy at Takeda, a global pharmaceutical company. I'm part of Takeda's global portfolio division, which covers about 80 countries. And before joining Takeda, I worked at Meta and McKinsey and have previous experience as an engineer, a naval officer, and an attorney. And currently, I focus on responsible innovation, which includes responsible AI. And that's a nice segue. You've probably heard this term, responsible AI, or maybe you've heard a similar term like ethical AI, trustworthy AI, or other variations. But what does this really mean? If you Google responsible AI, or these days if you ask ChatGPT, you'll quickly find a list of principles, some version of transparency, accuracy, fairness, privacy, accountability, agency. And these principles are usually accompanied by some sort of commitment to maximize AI's benefit and minimize its harms. Now, these principles are a great starting place for building and using AI responsibly. They set a common ground for what we think good might look like. But as we all know, the devil is always in the details, and principles alone usually don't give us all the answers we need. And even a principle that seems pretty straightforward, like, for example, killing other people is bad, it has complexity and gray areas, to consider self-defense, for example. So when we get to responsible AI principles, though they are a good starting point, they're usually not going to provide the details we need to navigate all of the complexity and gray areas of responsible AI. So go back to the drawing board. What does responsible AI mean? And before diving in deeper, I'd like to share a story. So recently, my colleague, an experienced runner, he got a new smartwatch. My colleague and I had both traveled across the Atlantic for a multi-day workshop, and he was telling me about the sleep tracker on his watch, which of course runs various AI models. He said that the first morning after arriving, the watch told him that he hadn't slept well and that he should take it easy on his morning run. But he thought it was weird because he felt great. And then the second morning, the watch told him that he had slept really well, but he actually felt super tired. So I'll interrupt my own story to say that it's easy for us to think about responsible AI in the context of the big stuff, things with serious consequences when they go wrong, like self-driving cars running into someone, life-saving devices, weapons. And these days, we're hearing more and more about how AI is amplifying societal harms, impacting the environment, even dramatically changing the workforce. And all of these topics are super important, and some are even existential. But the secret about responsible AI is that the day-to-day, the seemingly small stuff is where we can have a lot of impact. None of us here can solve the big stuff on our own, but each of us can make or influence day-to-day decisions about how we build and use AI. And these day-to-day decisions add up, and sometimes they even add up to the big stuff. I think social media is a great example. It started as this fun consumer product for friends to figure out what was going on that weekend, share photos, mostly harmless. And then as social media platforms grew, a lot of seemingly small decisions were made about how these platforms would collect data, how AI algorithms would use this data to personalize content, serve ads, and so on. And as we all know today, social media ended up becoming a major part of the big stuff. It's become a channel for mis and disinformation. It sometimes amplifies hate speech. It has undermined elections. And some have even gone as far as saying that social media has become a threat to democracy. And all of this through a series of day-to-day decisions about AI. So we go back to my friend and his watch. It seems like a harmless piece of technology. Everyone has a smartwatch these days. My friend's watch, like most smartwatches, has AI-driven features that deliver conclusions, sometimes accompanying recommendations based on information it collects about him. You didn't sleep well, conclusion. So take it easy on your run today, recommendation. So now at what point does this AI undermine my friend's ability to think for himself? For him, it turns out what the watch says doesn't matter very much. I mentioned he's an experienced runner. He knows his body really well. He can make his own decisions. But what about someone starting on a weight loss journey, or a young teenager, someone who's not as in tune with their body? Maybe the smartwatch company shares aggregated information with a social media site. The site figures out somehow, because they have a lot of data, that this person is ramping up workout activity. This person starts seeing ads for energy drinks and supplements, tons of content from athletic influencers. Meanwhile, this person is receiving conclusions and recommendations from a smartwatch that don't match how they feel, like what happened to my friend. So they don't know whether to listen to their body, the smartwatch, social media content, and one thing leads to another, and this person ultimately develops unhealthy habits to get faster results. And then, end up with some serious health or mental health issues. Now, all of this may sound far-fetched, big story, but really it isn't. One example from the past that some of you may recall is the story of a driver who followed their GPS and almost drove off a 200-foot cliff in New Mexico. This is from, I think, 2008. Similar stories came out at the time. And it might be tempting to think that the people using the GPS just weren't that smart, but it's not that simple. In fact, automation bias, which includes over-relying on certain types of AI systems, has become a well-known and deeply studied phenomenon. There are plenty of other recent examples, including how a 10-year-old girl from Italy died when she participated in a TikTok challenge that went viral based on TikTok's algorithm, or how doctors are increasingly trusting AI blindly at the expense of their patients' health, despite knowing the shortcomings of AI's bias and accuracy, and despite the doctor's own expertise. So when we look back, it can be tempting to dismiss all of these examples as outliers, but they really show just how easily day-to-day decisions about AI, what data we use, the design of how people will use the AI, how we frame the problem we're solving, even the problems we decide to solve in the first place, can add up to the big stuff. So none of us, I know, got into AI or tech to harm people or make people's lives worse. AI is exciting precisely because of its potential to improve our experience. It's intellectually engaging, and some people in the field of responsible AI are afraid to say this out loud, but many of us are also in AI and tech because it's a field with good jobs, exciting professional opportunities. It pays the bills. And our employers can only pay us, they make money, and so the AI we build has to make money. And here is where things get really interesting. Is it possible to build and use AI that is both good for people and good for organizations, good for companies? That's where responsible AI comes in. And some people think responsible AI is for people who don't understand the pressures of doing business on a timeline with a budget. But this is short-sighted. It turns out that ignoring responsible AI carries significant costs. Sometimes these costs are borne by companies themselves in rework or lawsuits. Sometimes they're borne by customers who ultimately abandon the brand. And by the way, you can certainly not make any money without customers. Or by those unlucky enough to be stuck with the externalities, which can contribute to longer-term economic or political risks that ultimately come back to bite us all. So with this in mind, at the end of the day, you are the ones who hold in your hands the power to build and use AI so that it enhances our human experience. You get to decide, should we build it? Can we build it? And are we building it right? And this is responsible AI. It's about all of these decisions. And responsible AI is a personal responsibility that belongs to each of us. So now that we know what responsible AI is and why it's important, we're going to run through 3 things you can do to navigate it. Commit to cross-functional collaboration, make it about driving value, and always be learning. And I know that last one sounds really simple, but hopefully I can convince you it's more than that. So first things first, for effective responsible AI practices, you must commit to cross-functional collaboration. Responsible AI is one of the most cross-functional topics out there. And this is what makes it both super interesting and super challenging to implement. And if we recall the responsible AI principles I mentioned earlier, fair, privacy protective, accurate, a number of functions together have to figure out what this means in the context of the AI products they're building. So we take the responsible AI principle of being privacy protective as an example. Since GDPR, the comprehensive privacy law of the EU that many of you have heard of, since it passed in 2018, many countries, over 70% across the globe, have passed national privacy laws. And most of these laws have extraterritorial effect, which means that you might still have to comply when you're outside the jurisdiction. In the US, we don't have a national law, but we have several state laws, and they also have extraterritorial effect. So what does this have to do with AI? Well, obviously, AI is driven by data, and many AI algorithms deal with personal data, which falls under the umbrella of privacy laws. And I actually happen to love this diagram. This is what happens in an internet minute. This one's from 2021. And it gives you an idea of just how much data we're talking about here, much of which feeds into AI models. So as regulators increasingly focus on what to do with AI, one of the major topics of discussion is how this overlaps with privacy and data protection. I provided some resources on this slide that you can explore that kind of gets into that overlap. And as you build AI and work on all the activities that go with it, collecting data, creating data pipelines, training models, so on and so forth, it's critical for product teams to work early and often with functions like privacy, data engineers, data governance, security, and so on. Otherwise, you may very well build a nice AI product, but one that happens to violate data regulations or society's expectations about how you should be using their personal data. And this won't just get you into trouble, but eventually alienate your customers. So another example where cross-functional collaboration is particularly important is AI bias. One of the most classic examples of AI bias is in hiring algorithms. You may remember when Amazon famously killed an AI-driven hiring app when they discovered it was discriminating against women because the AI was trained on historic data that encoded gender biases. This infographic from the World Economic Forum outlines common sources of harmful AI biases. And in the appendix of this presentation, I also provided a one-pager with kind of a high-level overview of what AI bias is, why it's a problem, where it comes from, how you can address it. What's interesting that at their root, many harmful AI biases are not actually technical questions. They're questions of society, cognitive science, medicine, justice, any number of other disciplines. So when we build an algorithm to, for example, help us make a hiring decision, it's not enough to build an AI trained on past hiring data and call it a day. That's where it's critical for the product team to work closely with HR, DEI experts, legal, privacy, potentially others, to design an AI that actually helps you find the best talent without perpetuating unfair hiring patterns and, frankly, unnecessarily shrinking your hiring pool. So what does all of this mean? First, each of these functions we're talking about has a different vocabulary, and yet people need to be able to communicate with each other. So stay away from jargon, make time to learn about other functions, and there are probably people in your organization who are fluent in more than one discipline, so to speak. It's really helpful to work with them and develop internal taxonomies and standards to help bridge some of these communication gaps. Another recommendation is to start small and start concrete. And what do I mean by that? For most companies, effective cross-functional collaboration is largely aspirational. Even companies who do it well are likely not doing it quickly enough, well enough to keep up with the speed of AI. So rather than trying to boil the ocean and restructure your entire organization, ring fence one or a few projects staffed with relatively tight cross-functional teams. And the goal is to get these teams beyond coordination. Now, coordination is usually insufficient and even painfully inefficient, and closer to integration. And the ring fence is important because it enables experimentation without being bogged down by past ways of working that may not be fit for purpose. Then run frequent retrospectives, iterate on best practices, and before you know it, you'll have a playbook, or at least the beginning of one. And then finally, you really have to think about how to incentivize people across functions to come together. It's nice to think it'll just happen, but unless KPIs, performance reviews, bonuses, et cetera, are aligned, any collaboration that's born of curiosity or goodwill, it won't last. People need to know that the extra work required to collaborate across functions is valued, because make no mistake, it's extra work, but hopefully I've convinced you that it's critical and worth the effort. Okay, so second topic for how to do responsible AI, and this might seem counterintuitive, But responsible AI should be all about driving value. In the space of responsible AI, we often think in terms of risk mitigation. And in fact, a lot of the time, that is exactly what we're doing. We're anticipating and mitigating risks. There's plenty of research that focusing on risks creates a sense of urgency, it drives initial investment. But in the day-to-day, it can fall short, that approach can fall short. And there are many reasons for this. One cognitive bias we can think is called absence blindness. This is a term from Josh Kaufman, and he describes absence blindness as the difficulty we have as humans in acknowledging what we can't see. So think about risk. By definition, risk is something that has not happened yet. It's a potential harm. And if we successfully mitigate the risk, what happens? Nothing, absolutely nothing. If nothing happens, then absence blindness makes us forget the importance of risk mitigation. So one way to hack absence blindness so that we make smart day-to-day responsible AI decisions is to reframe discussion around risk in terms of concrete, tangible value propositions. This is why I found that thinking in terms of driving value brings people together more effectively. Now, the tricky bit is defining what value means. At its core, value you'll see that it ends up meaning, we build the right things and we build the things right. Are we solving a real problem for people, which leads them to buy our product? That drives value. Are we doing it at the expense of sensitive intellectual property, for example, by feeding proprietary data into models like ChatGPT that are owned by third parties? That destroys value. And in the end, we want to both create and protect value, not destroy it. We also want to consider value from the perspective of each of our other stakeholder groups. So this slide presents one way you can think about this within your organization. But where this gets super interesting is how it overlaps with what we just covered about cross-functional collaboration. So successfully driving value requires multiple perspectives and areas of expertise. And so we have to do it together. And when we do that, we get an AI product that both creates and protects value. And the outcome is a trusted AI product. And that has pretty significant implications. People trust it because it's solving a real problem. It's not harming people. It's performing well financially. And in fostering this trust, you prime people to trust your future innovations and establish a long-term kind of symbiotic value-driving relationship. You essentially create a sustained innovation cycle. And what could be more valuable? So a few practical points for how to think in terms of driving value. First, always start with why. Why are you building this AI? What's the intended impact? And this is how you stay grounded and test whether you're veering off course, which happens. You get an idea, there's a challenge. As you resolve the challenge, you discover a cool solution, but maybe it requires you to sacrifice, say, someone's privacy. Sometimes that sacrifice may or may not be okay. Obviously, you want to comply with laws and all of that, but sometimes that trade-off is okay. Going back to the why will help you keep those trade-offs in perspective and let you know if it's not. Second, don't forget about the long tail. We talk a lot about collecting data, training models, testing models. These are all the things at the beginning of the journey. We often don't talk as much about post-launch, like monitoring for model drift, retraining models, and so on. These activities fit under the broader umbrella of machine learning operations, or ML ops for short, as many of you know, which is a critical capability for taking models to production and then maintaining them. This absolutely must be incorporated into your value calculation. Otherwise, a product that's both creating and protecting value today may easily become a liability tomorrow. And then finally, take time to look through the eyes of your various stakeholders. Each of them sees value differently. So customers are concerned with utility and quality of your product. Shareholders are concerned with financial performance. Regulators are concerned with compliance, and so on. And in the best case, you'll be able to align these views. I like to imagine this as a sort of additive synthesis. In other cases, some of these views may be at odds, and that's okay. But at least you'll be able to make deliberate trade-offs and articulate the reasoning behind your decisions. And that's the kind of transparency that can go quite a long way. Okay, third and final thing that we'll cover is making learning part of your job. I know it sounds basic, maybe a little bit obvious, but I'd like to emphasize that this really should be a core part of your job. This space is so fast moving that if you're not seeking to learn what's out there, you will fall behind. You'll make mistakes. You won't get to learn from others. So at a business model level, we've all heard some of the classic examples of what can happen when you're not picking your head up and looking around. We all remember when Netflix ate Blockbuster when Borders books went under, but Barnes and Noble didn't because they got the memo about online sales and e-readers. So similarly, they're really strong signals for what we might expect if we fail to learn from other companies' mistakes relating to responsible tech and responsible AI. So as an example, laws like GDPR, hundreds of data protection laws that have followed, the recent crackdown on personalized ads through EU's Data Act, FTC's increased enforcement actions in the US, all of these have been in response to really unfortunate events like Cambridge Analytica, the Target pregnancy scandal from many years ago that some of you may remember, and then many incidents since those. This huge amount of regulatory activity didn't come from nowhere. In part, it's because many companies pushed the boundaries too far and didn't pay close enough attention when other companies started getting into trouble. So today, regulators are laser focused on AI, if you haven't noticed. We saw earlier that there are over 800 AI-related policy initiatives globally, and several regions are working on AI laws like EU, Canada, China, just to name a few. There's also a growing number of state AI laws in the US. Here's a nice graphic on the slide from Stanford's recent report. And OpenAI, who you all know is the developer of ChatGPT, is already under attack. The Italian data regulator banned ChatGPT. It's issued a set of requirements that OpenAI has to comply with. They're also under investigation by French, German, Irish, and Canadian regulators. And even in the US, which has been reluctant to regulate the tech sector, the Biden administration right now is seeking input on how to oversee AI models. So again, this attention from regulators isn't coming from nowhere. It has to do with companies and people pushing the boundaries, making day-to-day decisions that have been accumulating and have already or will become the big stuff that we mentioned earlier. So to our theme of picking your head up and always be learning, we need to stay aware of the pitfalls other organizations are facing and try to learn from them. Now, you may say, learning sounds nice, but I'm so busy. Yes, and I believe you. Which is why internalizing that learning is a core part of your job is critical. Don't treat it as an extracurricular. And so here's some ideas for how you can do it. If you spend any time on social media, I highly recommend curating responsible AI voices on LinkedIn. There are a lot right now, really high quality as well. And seek diverse perspectives because you should be suspicious of anyone who claims to know all the answers in this space. Now, if you're driven by what's in your calendar, write in calendar blocks. They don't have to be a 2-hour study session. Maybe it's 20 minutes before your meetings, a quick virtual coffee. Another option is to double task while listening to podcasts. These days, there are a lot of really great high quality podcasts focused on responsible AI, AI policy, as well as tech podcasts that discuss topics around responsible AI and regulation. So I've included live links in the table at the top right of this slide. For some resources you can peruse. Okay, so we are coming to the end and I want to save time for questions. So I'll just briefly highlight what I think is the key takeaway here, which is that responsible AI is about our personal responsibility to make smart day-to-day decisions and about how we build and use AI. And it's as much about the small stuff as it is about the big stuff. So we have a ton of questions from the audience, which is awesome. So I'm just going to take a look real quick. I'll quickly address one question that came in. It says, sounds like a new specialty area for the legal profession. No, and yeah, absolutely. There are actually a lot of lawyers who are now focused on developing expertise, particularly around AI. A lot of these folks have previous expertise dealing with data protection, like privacy issues, cross-border data, transfers and those sorts of areas historically, and they're evolving to help understand and help organizations now navigate some of the new AI regulations that are definitely coming. So absolutely an evolving area in the legal profession. Here's an interesting question. How would you balance regulation of AI against wider adoption and innovation? Yeah, I think this is an interesting question because I think there's always this fear that regulation is going to somehow stymie innovation or kind of put barriers up to adoption of a new of a new technology. And actually, what's been really interesting is that as we see what's happening right now with AI regulation, I think you heard a few times today, there's a lot of movement in the AI regulatory space. A lot of jurisdictions are starting to develop drafts. And while many of these draft regulations have a lot in common, it's kind of been interesting to track the differences. So for example, the EU AI Act is very much a horizontal regulation, and it's structured in terms of risk categories. The UK has taken a more vertical approach where each industry will be regulated in ways tailored for that industry. Canada is taking a consumer protection approach as a general matter. And we start getting into the specifics, you'll see some philosophical differences, a lot of economic drivers, and even political drivers. A good example of that one is China's draft generative AI regulation, which includes content moderation provisions that explicitly require that the content generated by AI is consistent with, quote, social order and societal norms. And so, how do you balance all of this? I think it's hard. I think a lot of regulators are trying to figure out how do we incentivize people to build responsible products, so that we don't have some of the disasters that have happened, in the recent history in terms of technology, and in particular data-driven technologies. So right now there are a lot of open calls for comments by governments. And if you have a perspective or a view, I think it is a good time right now to get involved and share what you think. Because I think the goal for most regulators is to incentivize something good, not to stop innovation from happening. But it's certainly not easy. Let's see. How do you plan for cybersecurity risk of AI since there are still so many unknowns? That is a great question. I will say I'm not a cybersecurity expert, but I had to answer this question because I recently listened to this really excellent podcast. I don't know if any of you have heard of Lawfare, but they recently did an episode on cybersecurity for AI in particular. And some of you in the cybersecurity profession may know this, but how you keep AI models secure, and then how you keep things secure from, AI-driven technologies. Both of those questions are really creating quite a lot of cybersecurity challenges. It's very, very complicated. I think that the cybersecurity profession, kind of like how the legal profession has a lot of new things to learn. I think the cybersecurity profession right now is innovating a lot and trying to figure out how do we do this? How do we do cybersecurity effectively, cost effectively, actually effectively, having the right outcomes. I think it's driving a lot of innovation there. So really interesting space to watch for sure. And I will do one more question. What is the very first thing that you think organizations must look at when beginning the AI journey? Well, I think the number one thing you have to think about is, what is the purpose? What is it that you're aiming to do? What are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to accomplish? I know that sounds really basic, but it's a question we really just don't spend enough time on when we think about things like AI. I think a speaker from an earlier panel said this earlier, if you're thinking about AI as a tool, if you think of it as a hammer, you're always going to be looking for nails to hammer down with the AI. Just because you have this new toy doesn't mean you have to use it. So number one thing, try to think about why you need it, why you want it, what's the purpose, what's the impact you want to have, what is the value it is going to drive. So I hope you guys enjoyed the talk, and Vicki Lynn, back over to you.
Thank you, Alejandra, for such a practical keynote. I'm sure that you'll get some questions, and Alejandra's LinkedIn information is included on the site there for you. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this session. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. This does officially conclude the Argyle AI ML Technology Leadership Summit. Thank you all again for joining us today and for engaging in our content. Thank you again, Alejandra, and thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.